just bring my laptop instead of turning that way. I can just.
Oh, okay.
And how does this get changed?
All right, I just got the thumbs up from the techie booth. Welcome this evening, both to those of you gathered here, and I know we have a fair online audience as well this evening, so it's wonderful to have all of you here. The only little promo I'm going to do is it's our bazaar this weekend, so as you leave, if you want to pick up a brochure about that and our Christmas events, you're welcome to, but we're not here tonight to try to convert you to a member of St. John's. We're here because we want to learn more about MAID, and we want to be able to ask questions of our speakers this evening. A special thank you to Dr. Challa, who is a doctor in the Halton healthcare system, who delivers these seminars usually to medical professionals, but she graciously agreed to adapt them for the audience this evening. Our thanks also to Karen Jones, Gordon Jones' daughter. I say Gordon because I didn't know your mom personally, so I always think about your dad. And to Pat, I'm just going to say Needham, so nobody has to guess who you are, Ken and Betty's daughter, both of whom have a parent who chose MAID. And perhaps I should say that it was their willingness to include me in the journey that their parents took that was really transformative for me and my understanding and appreciation of MAID. And I was so grateful for the quality time that I was able to spend with your parents during that journey. So the way things will unfold this evening, I envisage about an hour and a half of time together. You may have questions that take us beyond that, but if once 8:30 arrives, if we're still chatting and you feel the need to leave, we won't be offended at all. Time is precious. So Dr. Challa will present first. And then both Karen and Pat will share a bit of their personal story. Then we will open the floor for questions. We have learned with our live streaming that people online cannot hear when people comment and ask questions from the audience. So I will be circulating with a microphone, and we ask you please to speak into the microphone when it comes time for questions. I will also attempt to keep track of questions from our online folk. For some reason, they seem to be slow sometimes coming into my phone here in the sanctuary, but I will certainly do my best. So, Dr. Challa, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I apologize in advance if this is a little too detailed. I'm going to try to keep it relevant to what I think we need to talk about, and then whatever questions you have later, we're happy to delve into them after. So I'm Akriti. Okay, better? Okay. I'm Akriti. I'm a family physician by training, and I work out of Halton Healthcare, but I do MAID provisions for patients both in hospitals and also in the community, in basically all of Halton Hills. And I today just want to talk to you a little bit about how MAID came into being, what it entails, who qualifies, and just some statistics to, give you a little bit of idea of who's accessing this. So I'll go through learning objective today. Our learning objective really is to provide education around this subject, and hopefully by the end of it have a robust question and answer so that we put all the questions at ease for you guys. So essentially MAID was made legal on June 6, 2016. They passed Bill C-14. It came into effect June 17, 2016. And essentially what it does, it allows a person to have a voluntary request where a medical professional either helps end their life, or with the help of medications they help end their life, which is then was considered legal once this bill was passed. They made, initially when this bill was passed, they essentially needed a patient's death to be reasonably foreseeable. And what that means is that you were suffering from something that we knew would eventually in the near future end your life. And because of that end coming near, the suffering that comes towards that, it was to alleviate that suffering. However, it was important that it was obviously voluntary, not from pressure of anybody else. It was because you were enduring some suffering that was not relieved by any other medical interventions possible, like palliative care. But it was really important that you had capacity till the moment of provision. And what that means is, if you chose to undergo medical assistance in dying, you needed to be able to competently to ask for that till the minute before the administration of medications. And the reasonable foreseeable death was a really important part. In March of 2021, they made a change saying, we no longer need your death to be reasonably foreseeable because there are medical illnesses that could be causing you suffering much more in advance than when we think, okay, this person may be passing away. The suffering can go much longer than that. And the second thing that changed with the changes in March of last year was you didn't need to have capacity till the moment of provision. And what that means is that you could plan in advance to say, listen, I might not have capacity due to multiple reasons on this day. However, I have made up my mind and I would like to get some help passing away on the date and the day of choosing in advance. And this, again, is really important when you start thinking of, people who might have suffered from dementia, people who might be end of life on palliative care with medications, helping them with symptom control, but the side effect of that medication really becomes that they start to become more confused or drowsy or sleepy. It allowed them to still receive palliative care till the very end, but then also having the autonomy of choosing that this is the way they wanted to pass. The other part of natural death not being reasonably foreseeable, which was the second part of the change, it allowed you to access that. However, the biggest thing was you needed a specialist in your field of diagnosis to say, it is a diagnosis that we don't think that we could cure. So you do need a specialist involvement in those scenarios. I don't know if people follow this very closely, but in March of next year, they're planning on coming up with a revision where mental illness could be the primary diagnosis. Now, up till now, mental illness being the primary diagnosis is a reason not to qualify for MAID up till now. But in March of 2023, there are plans of changing that. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of criteria they come up with, because it'll have to be robust. But that is going to be a change that's coming up in the next year. Just going over some statistics of how much or how many people have accessed MAID over the last 6 years, I suppose. Up in 2021, there was about 10,000 Canadians who have accessed medical assistance in dying. And if you look at the chart, in 2016, when it first came into inception, there was about 1,000. So as you can see, the rate of people who are, again, accessing this service is increasing every year. And certainly could be because of education and knowledge around that. In terms of MAID by condition, yep, thank you. The biggest diagnosis that we tend to see is cancer. Cancer ends up being one of the primary diagnoses that people tend to access MAID, but there are, as you can see, multiple other diagnoses, cardiovascular, respiratory, neurological, or multiple conditions, and not just one diagnosis. It could be multiple smaller things that add on to an individual's suffering. When you look at the type of cancer, lung cancer has been, as you can see, primarily the one that has been accessed for MAID. But again, in order, lots of interesting diagnosis there that people do tend to choose that. One thing that I personally, anecdotally, have noticed that neurological conditions are becoming a little bit more prominent for people who are asking for this. And I think the reason being is that in March of last year, when they changed the criteria that natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, and that category comes into play, a lot of neurological conditions could be conditions that can trouble people for many number of years, and it is not something like maybe cancer where things move a little bit faster. So I think the reason why we're seeing more of that is since the change in the bill in March of last year. There's MAID by age category and by settings. It's quite interesting to me, most MAID provisions are actually done in people's homes and residence rather than hospital. Of course, it changes based on different factors, but primarily at this point, it's still being accessed in people's homes. So, just talking about eligibility criteria. I'll move forward a few slides. So, at this point, for someone to qualify for medical assistance in dying, a few things need to be true. You have to be over the age of 18. You have to be a Canadian resident who's qualified for OHIP. You have to make a very voluntary decision. This is your decision. It is not coming from a family member or a caregiver. You have to be capable of understanding what is it that you're asking for, which means that you have to be mentally quite clear before you ask for this. It has to be informed consent, and what that means really is knowing what you're saying yes to, knowing what MAID entails, understanding that, and then saying yes or no. And the whole idea of the grievous and irremediable medical condition, as I mentioned, that has changed to a certain extent that it doesn't need to have death, natural death, reasonably foreseeable. That category has changed. But it has to be something that's causing you suffering that is not relieved by any other medical interventions. And that suffering is subjective, as we know. It's to the individual. We'll just quickly talk about not eligible, a few slides down. Right now, mature minors where mental illness is the sole underlying diagnosis, or advanced requests. And what that means is someone saying, well, I don't need MAID right now, but when X, Y, and Z happens, please go ahead and qualify me for that time. So what that is saying is that when we start having these conversations, you could have these conversations at any given time, but we start doing the eligibility assessment when someone feels that, you know, I've thought about this might be something that I'm seriously considering. Briefly, just talking about barriers. I was just talking to you, the ladies here, about barriers in terms of accessing MAID. Of course, there's a moral argument, social and societal pressures. The vulnerable population, and always worried about a vulnerable population, or the ability for someone to abuse this service, we have to be quite cautious, and that's why all these assessments are in place to make sure that this is really coming from the person, individual, and not because of any pressures from anybody around them. And then other barriers can be, how do you access it? If someone has thought about it, what now? How do we go about getting the right people involved? And sometimes just not knowing who that person is, who to contact. So those are certain barriers that we sometimes find when people are asking for that. I just want to take a couple of minutes on just telling you what that is, and then I'll try to wrap up. So if somebody, and I'll tell you from my point of view how we come to know, we usually are consulted by either in a hospital setting through the physicians who are looking after patients or the nursing staff, or in the community, usually it is the palliative care team and community home care, LIN. I don't know if you guys are aware of the LIN services. So they are usually involved with patients, and the patient will say, listen, I know I'm getting palliative care, but I heard about MAID, can you help me? And then we get tagged from the community care services or the services within the hospital to start the consult process. And essentially, in terms of the process itself, it entails an individual asking for this, and we get them to sign a paper which is called Clinician Aid A, and that basically says, the person, the individual says, I'm asking for this, it's a voluntary request, I'm doing this out of my own volition. It does need to be witnessed by one independent witness, and what that means is it cannot be anybody who might benefit from you passing away. So anybody who might be part of your will cannot be that witness. So it has to be somebody who is known to you maybe, but does not in any way or form has any association with you passing away. So this, again, the reason why we want to have that is we want to not have any reason for, you know, an abuse or a vulnerable population being abused here. So we want to make sure it's an objective person who's seeing you witness that. Then it goes on to two people, two medical professionals, it could be a physician or a nurse practitioner, who comes and assesses you to see whether you qualify. And again, those two people cannot necessarily have a relationship where one is the other person's boss, because you don't want to have any, you want to have a very objective assessment at two separate times to make sure that people qualify, and then you move that case forward. Just to talk about if you could do provision in the community. And the thing that we have in the community is our home and palliative care services, who end up helping patients and their families kind of navigate this whole pathway. I will stop the slideshow now, and the last thing I'll mention is when we do the provision for MAID, we typically would use medications that we use for people who are undergoing surgical procedures, but the dosing is much different. So essentially it is putting somebody to sleep, but in a very deep sleep. It's a very peaceful process, and I've been involved in multiple of these, and it's a very calm and very quick, very peaceful procedure. I will end my presentation here, and I'll save questions for later, I'm assuming. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm going to have to do this for... Let me see if I can do better. Oh, there we go. That a bit better? Yeah. Hi. I'm Karen Jones, and I'm really happy to be here. a friend that I told I was coming tonight said, well, I hope you have a good time. Am I allowed to say that? And I said, you know, it's a really meaningful thing for me, and I'm really grateful to be here. So, so my father, Gordon Jones, who was a member of this church for a long time, chose to have MAID, and just thought I'd just share a little bit about that experience. He did it, it was 2019, so it was before the laws had changed, and so some of the things that impacted us would no longer be the case, especially needing to be cognizant and sort of agree on the final day. So that was actually quite challenging, and I was part of a couple of committees that did some, put some things forth about that and shared that experience, because obviously someone that's in palliative care and struggling, it's hard for them to, there's cognitive decline, and so that was a difficult piece for us to balance. So my dad went into the hospital, into Emerge with some heart failure. He was in his 90s, he had congestive heart failure, and he had chosen not to do some surgery already. He felt very grateful and happy for his long life, and he was okay to know that that was coming to an end, and he didn't want a lot of medical interventions. So he went into the hospital because he hadn't chosen to do that surgery, and had a couple of other infections and things that had come up, and he was very clear right from the beginning that he wanted some medical assistance in death, that he did not want to have to be in the hospital and not be well and sort of living there for months. So we really wanted to support him, and I was really grateful that he was very clear about that, and we were able to access some of the support to do that. So it took us a while to navigate the system. We were in the hospital and not at home, and until we got into palliative care, we didn't really connect with the MAID services. And so once we did, we had the sort of two independent assessments. I think it's a somewhat under-resourced system still, and so there was quite a lot of advocacy required on our part to make sure, like, is that other doctor going to come and do that, and is the next thing. So just something that I learned is that it's a bit of a difficult position to be in as a child or any kind of a relative of somebody that you're helping to go through this process, because you're also in the position of being their advocate at times, and it can be difficult to be advocating for something that you know that person wants, but it's still a difficult thing for your family to have to sort of be going through. So lots of support is really helpful, and it was really nice to have Jill involved in the church and some friends, but having that support was really important for us as we went through it. My father never wavered, never changed his mind as we went through the whole process. And I guess the other piece is there was a lot of checks and balances as you go through. They're continually asked, are you sure this is still what you want? And he always felt very clear about that, so that made it not easier, but just the path that we were taking was quite clear for all of us. And as soon as it was sort of deemed that he could go ahead and have MAID, he was just incredibly peaceful and so relieved and so grateful that he had some control, I think, over how things were going to go and how his time would end, and that he was very concerned about burdening people with his care, even though that was something we didn't mind doing. But that was a concern of his, and so I think there was a relief on that end as well. And for someone who'd been incredibly independent and in control of his life, I think to get to have some control at the end felt really, really good for him. So we organized a nice service on the day that he was having MAID, and he had the opportunity to say goodbye to people in a lovely way and have visitors come, and as sad as it was for all of us, it was also very lovely that we could all be there with him for that and feel that we'd sort of helped him with this wish that was really important to him. And yeah, I think that's sort of everything I have to share about our story.
mediums are short. There we go. My experience is very different than Karen's, but in a lot of ways very similar. And my experience with MAID started in late 2019. And just as a bit of a background, my mom and dad had celebrated their 75th year of marriage in February, and then my dad passed very suddenly in July of 2019 and left Mom alone for the first time in her life at 95. She was living at Palermo Village, retirement village, and when I would visit, she would give me articles from the Toronto Star on medical assistance in dying. I couldn't visit without her asking me who she could get to help her with this. After a few months of ignoring her pleas, I told her I would look into it if she was sure she wanted this. She was. The nurse practitioner at Palermo was very aware of Mom's wishes and very helpful to me. Over the course of the next 18 months, Mom asked the nurse practitioner on her weekly visit whether she would help her. She told friends she wanted it. She left notes at the front desk at Palermo. She even asked the general manager for his assistance in this. She absolutely wanted this. Sadly, this was during the initial stages of COVID lockdown, and for several months no one was allowed to visit her. She ate meals in her room by herself, and with profound hearing loss, socializing on the phone was very difficult. In late summer 2020, the nurse practitioner had a MAID assessor visit, and I was there, but I wasn't sure what I was allowed to say or contribute, because as someone who obviously had a vested interest in her will, I didn't want to make it look like I was involved. So Mom said she wasn't able to advocate her medical needs. She said she was lonely, she was missing her husband, she didn't want to be a burden, none of which is a MAID criteria. Fast forward to summer 2021, and the same assessor visited Mom, but I was not in attendance. The assessor deemed there was little change and she did not meet the criteria yet. In actual fact, there was quite a bit of change in her medical requirements, but again, Mom was unable to voice this. Mostly, I believe, due to an upbringing of you don't talk about your ailments and you don't talk about your pain. Last December 2021, I sat down with Mom and she listed and I wrote down all her medical ailments and told her these were the things that she needed to talk about. Arthritis in her hands, pain in her back and shoulder, profound deafness, loss of sight in one eye, congestive heart failure, she was basically, there were other issues I won't go into, but in short, she was unable to do anything for herself. She couldn't even make herself a cup of tea. With the assistance of a walker, she could get from the living room to the bedroom, and that was it. In late January, she made the decision to discontinue all her meds, and the nurse practitioner asked if we would like to pursue MAID another time, as the concern was that she, without her meds, would have a stroke that would not be catastrophic and would be in a situation where she would be there and not able to make decisions for herself. Things moved pretty quickly after that. The nurse practitioner gave me the name of a different MAID assessor, and I spoke to him and told him Mom's situation. He visited her the next day, and on her own, with her list in hand, she was able to advocate for herself, and she was approved, with the nurse practitioner providing the second assessor approval. The next week was a flurry of visitors able to say goodbye. She had lovely visits with family members and close friends, tea with each of her granddaughters. Her granddaughters were able, I should say at this point, that for the longest time I didn't tell anybody but my husband that I was assisting Mom, because I thought that my daughters would be really upset about this. But in actual fact, when I did tell them, They said, "Good. We're really proud of that." So the nice thing at the end was that people were able to visit. They were able to have a cup of tea with her. She was able to tell them that she loved them, and they were able to tell her that they loved her. So on February 10th, 2022, over 2 years after first discussing MAID, my brother and I and our spouses shared a glass of wine and some nuts and bolts with Mom and said our goodbyes. My takeaways from this are, it is important to be or to have an advocate. The extremely elderly have little to no control of anything in their lives, and MAID offers them this. After my experience, I feel MAID is similar to a DNR. It is important to talk to family members about your end-of-life wishes. It is important to openly talk about MAID and dying with dignity. It isn't something to be ashamed of. So thank you to St. John's for holding this function.
Cindy, I'm not able to check on my phone to see if online folk are. Yeah, I'm on YouTube, but I can't get the comments, the usual things. So if there are questions there, can you alert me, please? Yeah, okay, awesome. So I will circulate with the microphone. I will hold the microphone for you just to reduce the number of hands touching it and passing germs around, I think, this evening. I do have one question for Dr. Chawla, which is, I was busy on my phone trying to watch what was happening, so I may have missed this. But in terms of making a decision ahead of time, for someone who is in the early stages of Alzheimer's, is there a provision for that yet? I guess I should.
Sure. So I think obviously all diagnoses are individually weighed out, but somebody in that scenario may approach a provider, for example, and say that I would be interested in doing this. And they could say that, you know, my criteria is X, Y, and Z, but we then start the process when we know that this is something that they are serious about rather than just a fluttering thought. And the reason being, we don't want to take action on something that may pass. It is something that we do want, because of the finality of it, we do want that it is something that you have thought through. In terms of setting a date ahead of time, there is, when you qualify for, there are two streams. One stream is when you know that natural death is reasonably foreseeable, and there's no wait period required. So if, for example, somebody said, we know that they might pass soon because of a medical illness, we don't need to wait X amount of days. However, in, let's say, somebody who may have early onset dementia, but they're still living a very good, high-functioning life, when they are ready for it, they would need to wait 90 days from the day they say, I'm ready, to the day that we do the provision. So there's a 90-day reflective period for somebody who may have a diagnosis that says where natural death is not foreseeable. We do want to have a bit of a wait period for that category of people.
Excellent. Perfect. Questions?
Just from what you just said, and that next March, the possibility of the next step, would that alleviate, I don't know if that's the word, the 3 months?
So we don't know exactly what the criteria would be for now. What we do know is that up till now, or up till that change happens, you could have element of anxiety or depression, or there are cases where I've seen people where they have been suffering so much that they've really wanted to end things for themselves. So we do, medically speaking, we do categorize that under mental health. However, we do understand that some of that could be related to a primary diagnosis that is making them feel this way. Because mental health is not the primary diagnosis of their suffering, they still qualify. The new change in March is really talking about that your primary diagnosis could be of depression or anxiety or another mental health disorder without any other ailments that could be causing the depression. So the change that is meant to happen is related to the primary diagnosis. Yeah.
Do you foresee a spike in requests now that the law has been passed that seniors will be moved away from hospitals into care where they don't want to be?
What's the rule again? Do you mind refreshing what's the new thing?
So if you need to be in long-term care, you could be placed very far away from your home base now. So you may live in Oakville, but you might be placed, I think it's up to a few hundred kilometers away.
Yeah.
Bill 7, which the Ontario government has introduced, people needing what is called alternative level care, which is really geriatric care in hospitals, where people are waiting either for rehabilitation or they're waiting to go into long-term care or even receive home care, are going to be moved out without their consent.
Right.
To in southern Ontario, to long-term care homes, which will be 70 kilometers away.
Right, that's correct.
If you live in northern Ontario, up to 150 or even further if necessary.
Right.
And that out of reach probably of partners or contemporaries. And of course there is a court case being brought by this.
Right. Yeah. So do I think that there'll be a spike in cases? I mean, certainly it is possible because, your suffering could be related to multiple factors, and maybe being secluded could be part of it. Anecdotally, I do think working in a hospital system, the bill that has come up is really based on the practice that is already kind of in place. I know that it's not a bill that was formally passed, but typically speaking, when people are in hospital and waiting for long-term care, the preference is still given to areas that are close to them, and they're meant to pick certain amount of homes, as you might want to call them, but if those homes are full and there's no scope of having somebody, I know the radius does go longer and longer till somebody is able to be placed. So the answer is yes, maybe it's possible that there'll be a spike, but anecdotally I think that practice is somewhat already in place currently.
Hi, my husband has ALS, and we've put the package together, but we've been told the first practitioner has to be the doctor who's going to be administering the MAID program to us.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, so you have a primary assessor and you have a secondary assessor. Okay. With ALS, again, depending on where they might be in their disease progression, You might need the secondary assessor to be the specialist who have looked after your husband.
Okay, we've got the specialist, but we've been now told it's got to be the doctor who's going to administer the MAID program to us.
Typically, the person who should be the provider is the primary, but you can always have the secondary assessment done first. And the reason why we say primary and secondary is not who needs to do it first, but who is the provider. So, yeah, so it means anybody can start the process, but the person who will be doing the provision should be part of that one person assessing.
And we've been told that's a 6-week wait.
Oh, you can get in touch with me.
Okay, I'll get
Okay, that should not be the case. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk and for welcoming me to your church. I'm coming here as a Christian, and I'm wondering, well, okay, just so in light of the context, for what it's worth, when my grandmother was going to die, my mom said, now she has Alzheimer's, so she said to the doctor, if she's going to die, it's fine if she gracefully passes away. So we're not looking for any miracles here. She lived. Personally speaking, I thank God she lived. She taught me a great deal about leading me to a closer relationship to Christ. I'm so grateful she lived longer, even though it meant a great deal of inconvenience. And there's also people at retirement homes I've befriended, may their soul rest in eternal peace with Christ, who've made my life profoundly richer. And they've had profound lives living in homes far from in entirely new countries. All this to say that that's just a part of my pilgrimage. I'm wondering, in light of the Hippocratic Oath being something that doctors declare, that I take to be that they're not to do any harm, and in light of the context, Prithvi, I'm wondering, religion, what's your religion, and how does that inform your decision to take part in MAID?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. That's, yeah.
And Dr. Chella,
Yeah.
we had agreed ahead of time, so I'm the minister here at St. John's, and I had agreed to also answer any sort of ethical, moral issues. So
Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you want to speak to it?
Whatever you prefer. I'm happy to say something, but please feel free to take over. Yeah.
I sort of anticipated that question, and I was hoping actually to have an ethicist here who works at one of our local hospitals, but he wasn't able to be with us. Obviously, we don't take any of this lightly. You know, you are helping to end someone's life, and life is precious, life is valuable. Some Christians believe more strongly in predestination and in God's control over the details of our life. And they believe that death happens when God decides it should happen. The way I have now come to understand the process of MAID is this. With all of the medical procedures that are now available in the world, with all of the drugs that are available to us, many of us would have died years ago if we hadn't had the heart medication. If I hadn't started taking cholesterol medication in my early 30s, I might not be here now. So I think whether it's in a more passive way or a socially acceptable way, I think we all make choices in our lives that change what might have been the natural course for any of us. So the way I have come to understand MAID is that a person is making yet one more decision that changes what might have been the natural timeline for them. And ultimately, I believe in a God of grace who understands the human condition and understands the difficulties of this life. And so I believe, and having been present in deaths that involved MAID, the peace I have experienced being with those people leads me to believe that God was very much present. But it's a very good question, and I think it's a moral and ethical question that each person has to struggle with themselves. And again, I can only speak from my faith perspective, and I also speak from a particular branch of the Christian faith, and I think those of us who are Christians have various ways of understanding God and God's involvement in our lives.
Thanks, Sheila. I'm happy to comment on that from my perspective also. You asked the question of the Hippocratic Oath and first do no harm, and I think when you really think about this, for me, the biggest thing is how do we define harm? And for me, seeing somebody suffer and me not doing something for it might be a little bit more harmful rather than me being able to do something to alleviate their suffering. With the medical advances that we have come, we certainly see administering things where we might not fully agree with it, but the biggest thing is honoring the person's wishes. And it's not for everybody, and I respect that. But I think for me, it is being able to respect an individual and what they want, and the dignified manner that they want that in it trumps everything else. Sorry, say that again? I'm a woman of science. No. Sorry, science is my religion, I suppose. Or human beings are my religion. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. So I can't hear. I'm sorry.
I think we're we're crossing the line perhaps into a different debate. No need to. I think I need to be careful to keep us focused on the topic, perhaps. Nope, no worries.
I just have back to the topic. You mentioned that there's new legislation. Do you know who's influencing that legislation? Who's making that legislation? And how do you influence that legislation? What direction is it going?
That's a good question. I don't fully know the answer of this, definitely beyond my regular expertise, but I'm happy to find out for you and get back with an answer for that.
I think it's just a question, because I think a lot of the points you made point to that there's a need for
advocacy,
changing the legislation of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is advocacy happening on local levels, but there are organizations, and I know Dying with Dignity, and there's another organization called Bridge C14. So there are different organizations that are trying to advocate for these changes. But to be honest, I don't have a very good answer to your question. I will find that out, though.
Hello, my name is Paul, and I want to speak kind of a precursor to MAID. Fortunately, my wife and I do not have any family or friends who are in need of MAID right now, but I wanted to share an experience based on Pat's comments about how she affected her family and what they thought, and she was responsible for it and the duties she took. My wife and I are snowbirds, or we used to be anyways. In 2014, we decided to go cruising down south for the winter. And prior to that, we had our children all over for dinner, and we laid out to them what our wishes were should something happen when we were on the high seas, so to speak. And if there's a challenge, we wanted them to understand where we stood, and this is kind of a precursor to the MAID process. With our family, my wife and I laid out our plans for what we wanted, and we had this documented on paper, and when we had the discussion with them, they all agreed that they understood what our desires and wishes were. And therefore, I passed out the document back to the children. I said, you understand this is what we want? And they all said yes. And I said, please sign it. And they did. And they dated it. And the reason why we did that is because we felt something might happen during our experience. And just in case, we didn't want one of our children arguing with the other children about, no, Mom and Dad didn't really want that. And that's kind of a precursor, I find, to the MAID process and getting the family on board and everybody being in agreement where possible. I just want to share that.
Yeah, and I think that's, as Pat was mentioning, the DNR conversation, it is a very important conversation to have, because essentially we're trying to make sure that people have a say, right? At the end of the day, it is your decision, it is your wishes, and people around you, of course, for our own reasons, we do want families to be here for long and forever if possible, but part of it is respecting the wishes of our loved ones, not for us, but for them. And I think that is a difficult thing to do, because there's lots of emotions involved, and it becomes harder when you're in that moment when you have to make the decision. So having these conversations ahead of time, when we all are level-headed, cool, we can have this as a conversation, is so important. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Hi there. If you kind of get that sense that your family doctor is resistant to MAID, what are the other portals?
Great, yeah.
For a customer, like a patient.
I've never been referred to as a as a vendor before, but
didn't mean that way. For someone to be able to access.
Yes.
The portal to get.
Yeah, great question. So one of the things is Dying with Dignity, and that's like an organization that essentially is there to support people who have questions about this. If you go onto their website, just type Dying with Dignity on Google, you'll be able to access them. There's a helpline, and the helpline may be able to give you access to local providers. But the other thing I would encourage you to do is accessing through the LIN coordinator services. I find, again, this is anecdotal from my experience both in the hospital setting and a community setting, I find that there's more resources for MAID in the community right now than there might be in hospital settings. This is just my personal take on it.
Now, again, in terms of the eligibility criteria, and I think, Pat, your situation was very much like my mom's, but, she's 95, so is the end of life soon? Well, I think so.
Yep.
But it's the quality of her life for several medical reasons. It's just not there.
Yes.
So, like, my concern was, would she be eligible? I know you can't answer that question,
but I think in general speaking, I think because we have come further along with the MAID process and the eligibility criteria, and I think just also the knowledge around it and the education around it, that we understand a little bit better that we don't necessarily need a diagnosis per se. A lot of it is subjective suffering. Right? So if for somebody, it doesn't have to be age-related per se, but it has to be related to a suffering that the person is enduring. And based on that, I think people are able to qualify now more than ever because of the change in legislation since March of 2021. So I don't know your mom, but I do think that, given what you're talking about, I think she could qualify.
I'm going to hold it.
Okay. So, yes, it seems to me that the term that really covers what our two family survivors have mentioned, and perhaps you've mentioned too, is the term dying with dignity. And you've just further confirmed that impression with me when you've talked about subjective suffering. I must say I had assumed that this would be more related to pain, not just dignity.
Right.
I mean, I know that dying with dignity has been around for a long time. In fact, a minister who was very influential upon me was, in fact, the chair of Dying in Dignity in Britain. So I'd just like to hear your comments about whether this is, in fact, the main criterion, or whether some kind of more measurable suffering is the main criterion.
Yeah. I think there's, the reason why each case is so individual is because each person's suffering is very individual, very subjective, and to them. Somebody else's suffering I might be able to empathize with, but do I really know what they're going through? No, I cannot really measure their suffering. And I think that's why, especially with the change in legislation, it gives people a little bit more control rather than having a measurable diagnosis with a measurable prognosis, to open it to people who are suffering for much longer, where there is no prognosis or diagnosis that says, yes, this diagnosis would qualify. So I do think it is not a measurable suffering per se. It is really subjective. It is to the individual. It is very case by case.
I think worries me then about that is whether or not we are going to have a large population of people who want to have MAID, to die in dignity, because there is not a sufficient amount of palliative care available. I mean, the amount of budget that is spent on that is very small. And when I see what's involved in a bill like Bill 7, it seems to me MAID could easily become a way of disposing of those who might otherwise have quite a few years ahead of them.
Yeah, I think I agree with you in my worry around that aspect, and I think, a big portion, especially with even the changes they're planning on and bringing up with the whole mental health aspect, I think there's a sense of worry for sure that this is not a means to dispose of people who are unable to access good health care. This should not be a substitute. And I think people who are providers, there's a hesitancy in people being providers, because there are cases where we have been asked by people where being a burden becomes a criteria for them to primarily ask for that. So, I share your worry in that. The only thing I can say to that is people who are providers are very cautious, and that's why there are multiple steps along the way. There are also each case of MAID, and I kind of wish sometimes when I was earlier on in my journey with this that there was a preemptive discussion, but most cases are discussed with the coroner, and they provide you with some feedback if there is ever a reason to believe that this could be unethical or not legal. But I think there is definitely a worry, and this is why we have the processes in place, is to not, take advantage of the vulnerable, and the elderly population is a vulnerable population. Given the resources or the lack of resources, it's a big problem we're going to be facing. But this is where the advocacy, the individual advocacy, the family advocacy. I think another important thing that I do want to mention is one of the reasons why it becomes, I should say, easier, and I don't know if there's a better term for that, is when you see family members agreeing with the individual. I think that is a positive experience. And I think, again, when you start seeing people taking decisions because they see the suffering, it's beyond the fact that they're being sent to somewhere, a nursing home further away. It has to be beyond that. And I think when we measure the individual suffering, we do take into account multiple things, and we don't try to rush into this. It's not something that we want to take lightly. It definitely weighs on our own conscience when we do that. So it is a worry, though. I share your worry.
I was just going to say that this is not a quick fix. This is not something that happens, and there are so many checks and balances in place. We had the same assessor do it twice in 2 years, and she was extremely careful. I did hear that at some point some family member had brought her up against a tribunal. So she was extremely careful, and she was not going to cut any corners. And then when the second, you have to have more than the one assessor, and the second assessor was very thorough. And after he left, before he left, he said, "Thank you for being your mother's advocate," which to me was the nicest thing he could have said to me. And then before he left, I had to speak to the coroner, and I had to say what had happened. Was I happy with it? Did it go the way we planned? Was there anything I needed to report? So, ethically, I have actually been with 3 of my immediate family members when they've passed, and this was the nicest. This was the most peaceful. This was something that I'll carry with me. It was absolutely lovely. Sheila was there giving a prayer before, and I couldn't ask for anything nicer for my mother.
I think I'm just going to check the time. Oh no, we're still good. Just to respond to the comments that Karen and Pat have made about my presence, I think if you belong to a faith community, it's good to have that conversation with your faith leader. Certainly in some religions and in some branches of Christianity, MAID is not viewed like it is in the communities where we have a different understanding of God, predestination, that sort of thing. But selfishly, perhaps I would say that in these cases, and not only these 2 cases, I have had the opportunity to have conversations with people in more depth than I sometimes would have. I have been able to give thanks for a person's life while they're able to hear that thanks being expressed. I have been able to pray to God in the person's hearing for a peaceful passage, for a safe passage, for God and for all of those saints who have gone before them to stretch out their arms to welcome them home. And I would love for that to happen when I am making that journey through the thin veil. I would love to hear those words of Christian hope expressed in my hearing. So I would say certainly, if it's something you are choosing for yourself, I have been was someone who really had no faith connection to this congregation, but who wanted a person of faith there. And we were able to talk ahead of time about their faith, what they believed, some of their concerns. So I'm very open to that sort of conversation. So I think I saw about 3 hands up.
Can I just make one comment just to your question there about the palliative care? Just while you were speaking, it just came to me that, again, anecdotally, I think every person that I have been involved with who has accessed MAID did have access to or were on a palliative care program. So I don't know if that's any reassurance at all, but I know that resources can be slim sometimes when we look at the big picture. But on an individual basis, I think what is happening well is that people are attached to a palliative care service, and this happens as a secondary step more often than not.
When the parent passes away, and you've gone through this whole system like you two girls have, what happens after? Is there no, I don't know. Is there any guilt trips, or can you go somewhere like all of a sudden it's finished? Are you thrown to the wind, or can you go somewhere to keep for a period of time for yourselves? Or is there help after for a period of time?
Yeah, I can answer that. We had Jill at the church, so we had an opportunity to speak with her. But the MAID team, not at the church, we were at the hospital. We were at the palliative care unit at the Oakville Hospital, and the MAID team came to us through the whole process. But as we were getting close to knowing the date, they had a chaplain available to us as well, and so she came and met with us beforehand. And after my dad had the procedure, we stayed for a little bit, then we walked out into the hall together, my siblings and I, and the chaplain was there to meet us, and we went and sat with her for a while and chatted, and she just sort of asked if there were anything we needed. And then another representative from the MAID group helped us sort of navigate just sort of the final things we had to do in terms of the coroner and all of those things. And I can just say, I had a bit of a, crisis of guilt, or just a really it's a difficult relationship to be in before my father passed, because I was the one who, it's a strange thing to be advocating and having to push people to come and do this next appointment so that he can have what he wants before he has enough cognitive decline that maybe he can't do it. So I had this awful feeling of, I'm pushing for my father's death, even though it's what he wanted. It just felt wrong. But once I got sort of through that and understood it, I was all right. And at the end, I had the opposite of guilt. I felt so grateful that I had been able to help him with that. And I also saw him have such a positive death experience. My mother died of cancer, gave her a sip of water and she'd start choking. It was a terrible, even though she was in a hospice, it was a terrible couple of weeks, and awful to see her go through that. And I felt really peaceful and grateful that my father had that kind of a death.
I just had one comment listening to everybody, and this gentleman here, I think, said a lot that the new law should look at. He made arrangements, his meanings known. There should be a legal document you can do something like that holds up to allow the family to proceed with MAID, And I think, I can go examples. We've got very close friends that are suffering, and actually I had a chat with him today to see if he wanted to come, because she's got nuclear palsy, which is just a deteriorating disease, but she couldn't mentally. We know what her wishes would be. She's always expressed those wishes, but today she could not. She could not. But with a legal document like that if you're doing something or something's coming when you're still got solid mind, you can get a legal document says, these are my wishes, signed by witnesses, etc., it would do a lot to alleviate the family's concerns of how do we, this is what she wanted, but we can't get it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is medical directives that people can access and sign ahead of time. The medical directives don't account for MAID particularly, but they do. I'm sure that when you went through the process, you can legally say that if this happens, I would want, no resuscitation or resuscitation, whatever your choice is. But you can write down those wishes that you have for end of life or for a medical emergency. In terms of the whole MAID aspect, again, the reason I suppose why we don't have that is we don't want to exercise ahead of time when the person is not ready. But again, the new legislation does allow for some flexibility there where people who know they might want this, and if they know that the disease progression, they could start the process.
You still got sound mind when that process starts.
Yes.
And
yes.
That document, this gentleman here, I thought had a good idea.
We did it not so much as a legal document. We just did it because we wanted our children to be aware of our wishes. And we didn't want them fighting over, Mom and Dad didn't want that, when they know darn well we do. So that was all. Whether it stands up in court, I have no idea.
An instant. Should you put that in your will as a legal document?
What kind of your wishes are?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's always a good idea. We call it from a medical point of view, we call it the medical directive.
Yes.
So oftentimes we'll ask patients that, do you have a medical directive? And what we're really asking for is, have you had the discussion with somebody that if you were not capable in that moment, that the most appropriate person can act on your behalf on what your wishes would be. And that typically happens if you've had the discussion, you've written it down, or if it's part of your will. So you could make it a part of your will.
And the other thing, most of our friends here from the church know that my husband has Alzheimer's and he's in home now. But I never got him to sign something legally where he's not capable of now. To end his life at some point soon or in a few years. So you look at someone who becomes like a vegetable, or they drug somebody up, or unfortunately they're taking their underwear off and going to the washroom everywhere. It's no quality of life. But you can't change anything because he didn't sign anything before. But then if he had signed something legally, what would happen then as he deteriorated?
Yeah, I think Alzheimer's does become a bit of a tricky area, I would say. And I think the reason why it's tricky is because we don't really quite know when somebody will lose capacity completely.
Yes.
Or are they going fluctuation, the fluctuation of loss of cognition, and having, coming back where you can have a conversation, you have some understanding, but then you lose it again.
Yeah.
And I think it is a tricky one because even with that, when you look at the second track we talked about where, death might not be, natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, we can't still, the law says we can't have advanced requests.
No.
So we're not quite there yet where I absolutely empathize with the situation because you are now in a situation where if you knew beforehand, you would be able to do it. We're not quite there yet. And I think the reason, because of that fluctuation, it's a difficult thing to pinpoint and say this is the right time. Because often when you will be of sound mind, you still might have many number of
years,
yes.
Right?
So it is a area that's a little bit tricky.
But perhaps in time, the LIN, when they meet with you and someone has dementia of some sort, maybe they would have it in, do you want to discuss when they're ready? Because I have a letter when my husband wrote, I don't want to be a burden, which I still have the letter, but we never discussed.
And I think that's why it's such an important discussion to have. ahead of time, and I think, of course, there's like a morbidity attached to this kind of conversation, and we often avoid these conversations because of, maybe it seems too dark, it seems too premature, but having these conversations as just a regular conversation ahead of time with your family physician, with your loved ones is a very important one to have. But yeah, I wish I could have a better answer in terms of, the Alzheimer's diagnosis per se. It is a tricky one to qualify for, given once you kind of get to the advanced stages.
You go out of the country, Peggy says. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that is also riddled with some criteria that you have to meet before you could qualify there as well.
I know a question someone who's online was asking me ahead of time is, are the laws governing MAID national laws, or do they differ in each province? It's a Canadian law.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would say for now, for Harper's, it's a Canadian national law. Yeah.
Because having lived in Quebec for a number of years,
yeah.
there the freedom to use medication as a patient was nearing death was much more liberal.
Yes, I was going to say that's the biggest difference if you look from a national point of view, the biggest difference is self-administration of medications to have medical assistance versus a provider doing the provision.
Oh, okay.
That's like the biggest difference is it holds nationwide, but it is more prominent.
It can differ, because my experience was the use of morphine as someone near death was much more liberal than it is here.
Yeah. I think even with self-administration, there is a certain protocol they're meant to follow, and I think that the difference is that you give those prescriptions to the patient who's asking for it versus a provider doing that.
Right, yeah. Right. The other thing I just want to mention, because we've talked tonight about the sense of control that choosing MAID gives some people. I would also say to people here tonight, I hear people often say, oh, my kids can do whatever they want with me when I'm gone, I won't care. Please, think about your plans. Think about not only things like cremation or not. Please think about your funeral plans. Please, many of us have children who are not necessarily active in the faith that means so much to us. Please make notes about what you want in a service, because I have so many experiences of sitting down with younger folk these days who have not a clue what their parents would want in a service. And I think it's not only unfair to those children, it's also unfair to you not to have the sort of service that you would have chosen for yourself. So please, please make notes about that sort of thing. Any last questions? Don't speak yet, Lori. Hold it. I know that's hard. I know. I was going to say it runs in the family, but your mother might not forgive me for that.
Just very quickly, is there support groups that MAID gives the families, like a list of places that they can go? I realize the girls here, it was very peaceful and so on. But for some family members that were not in agreement with what happened, 2 or 3 weeks later, still can't come to terms with it. Is there programs available to those family members to go to try to work through it?
Yeah. You know, I don't think that there is anything significant out there. Most of these things would be accessible if, you know, the individual having issues reached out to their family physician and asked to, you know, be in some sort of counseling. Interestingly enough, I have a meeting with one of the Bridge C14 organization to talk about family supports, and from my perspective, I feel that could be something we could be doing better as people who are involved in this process, is having a support network. And I know it gets tricky with you know, keeping confidentiality and respecting that, but I do think this is an area where we might be lacking, where we could do a better job of coming together as a network and providing resources. In terms of family conflict, to be honest, I think the support system would be a great idea, but I think the conflict definitely needs to be addressed. And I thankfully have not come across a family where there has been disagreement about this, because it is a big deal. But I'll talk to you about an example. I had a patient who had ALS, and she'd been suffering from that for the last couple of years, and she was a young lady. And she had 2 young daughters. And while she was going through the MAID process, they were all put as a group part of family therapy for her diagnosis. So I know it's not very readily available to everybody accessing MAID, but I think some of these services are available for certain diagnoses, and I think ALS happens to be one of them through the organization they were involved in. But there's nothing formal just for people who are, you know, if you just look at MAID provision and pre and post, there's nothing that I know of. Did you guys have any?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention there's a new organization out of Toronto called MAID House, and they're actually providing a physical space for people that may not have that, and they're doing quite a few, like, developing offshoot like programs for families. So, and they have a lot of resources on their website.
That's a good one, actually.
So it is 8:23. I sense we're sort of winding down. Any last questions?
The only thing I would like to say, it's a difficult decision, but my husband and I have both donated our bodies to research. And I think if anybody hasn't planned what they would like, if they don't want to be buried or cremated, that anybody that helps with the research is so important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's a very good point. Same thing with organ donation. Like, even if you go through the MAID process, you still, based on the diagnosis, could qualify for organ donation. So again, something to have that discussion with your family members about that. Thank you.
So, you know, when we first thought about providing this program, this evening there was some discussion about whether or not the topic was too emotional, too controversial. It's always difficult to address a complex issue firsthand. And to ask the big questions. But I think what we experienced this evening was so important for all of us. I think to hear from a medical professional about it, to hear from 2 people who have experienced it with family members, and to hear a lot of questions about it, I think was a good experience for all of us. We thank those of us online. Cindy, no questions that you... Okay. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. Dr. Chawla, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and for adapting your presentation to those of us who are not quite as medically astute. Thank you, Pat and Karen, for being here, and again, my personal thank you for including me in your parents' lives and the end of their life. It was very meaningful to me. So thank you, and stay tuned. We're taking a little break for Christmas now in the church. Our bazaar is Saturday. It's going to be wonderful. There's brochures as you leave at the back or this way tonight. And stay tuned because we hope to provide more programming in the future.